This instructional video is on program design for flexibility training using the FITT-P principle. And there are plenty of videos, charts, and tables within this video which will guide you along and make it easier to understand. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. Similar to aerobic program design, we use the FITT-P principle to design flexibility programs where F stands for frequency, I stands for intensity, the first T stands for time or duration, the second T stands for type, and the P stands for progression. So as I mentioned in my instructional video for aerobic program design, if you fill in these 5 blanks, you've just designed a program for yourself, or in the case of a coach, you've just designed a program for your client. So I'll go over each of these variables to give them a little bit more clarity. Starting with frequency, while it's true you could stretch just 1 day per week, the research shows that benefits don't really occur unless it's a minimum of 2 days a week, which is the reason why I start off by saying frequency can range from 2 to 7 days per week. In the real world, time and desire are common factors that determine the frequency of stretching. And the tighter you are, the more volume you're likely to need. And one of the ways to increase volume is to increase frequency. The other way to increase volume is by performing additional sets, and that could be either back-to-back, such as stretching your hamstring, maybe moving on to another muscle group like your piriformis and stretching that, and then coming back and doing a second stretch for both your hamstring and your piriformis, or just stretching a muscle group, waiting a small amount of time, and then stretching it again. But the main thing to keep in mind is that tighter areas need more volume, and that's typically going to mean that 2 days per week of stretching isn't going to be enough. Moving on to the variable of intensity, and thinking about it in the form of a 1 to 10 discomfort scale, where 1 means very light discomfort or a very light feeling of a stretch, and on the other end of the continuum, a 10 being stretching to the point of pretty extreme pain. Generally speaking, you want to be somewhere in the middle of that discomfort scale, somewhere around a 4 to a 6. Having said that, research shows that lighter stretching like a 2 or a 3 may still improve range of motion for some people, and even stretching to the point of pain, which I would never recommend, but it has been shown to improve joint range of motion as well. But most people should stretch to the point of mild or moderate discomfort. Moving on to the subject of time or the duration of a stretch, the main thing to understand is that there's a minimum, and more specifically, that it takes somewhere around 15 or 20 seconds for a neural relaxation to occur. So if you're a coach stretching a client, or if you're stretching yourself, you want to stretch to your first end range of motion for somewhere around 15 to 20 seconds, during which time you mentally relax into the stretch. And then if there's a need for improvement in joint range of motion in that area, you would find at a minimum a second end range of motion. More on that a little bit later. And then the other way you can go about is through PNF, or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation stretching, which basically just means that it includes some sort of contract relax, where you're contracting the muscle that's being stretched or its antagonist or opposing muscle, followed by a relaxation, and then finding another end range. So really, it's doing the same thing. It's just including a contraction within the course of the stretch. And typically the way that type of stretching works is that you would find your first end range, hold the stretch for approximately 10 seconds, and then for about 6 seconds, you would contract the muscle at somewhere around 50 to 70% of your maximum ability to contract it, and then you'd move further into the stretch. So from a time or duration standpoint, it's really the same concept, because you're still at that first end range for somewhere around 15 or 16 seconds before you move into the second end range. Again, it just includes a contraction within that time, as opposed to just passively stretching, holding the stretch, and then moving forward. Moving on to type. Common types of stretching include passive, active, PNF, like I mentioned earlier, and dynamic. The difference between passive and active stretching is that with passive stretching, there's an external force being applied so that you're not completely performing it yourself, or in some cases, you're not performing it yourself at all, such as with a coach or a therapist who is stretching you, or using some sort of other external force, like when you're lying on your back and using a stretching band or a towel to stretch your hamstring. And then active just means that you are taking your joints through the range of motion without the use of an external force. Or in other words, you're just moving yourself through the range of motion. I've already described what PNF stretching is, and the difference between active, passive, and PNF stretching versus dynamic stretching is that you would use active, passive, or PNF stretching as a way to improve joint range of motion in areas that are tight. And with dynamic stretching, by definition, it means that you're either stretching a muscle for a moment in time, such as with leg swings, or up to just a few seconds in time. And the purpose is basically just to wake the muscle groups and the joints up prior to some sort of event, such as weightlifting in the gym or some sort of sporting event. And then lastly, when it comes to improving joint range of motion, as long as the program is set up with the proper frequency, intensity, duration, and that you're seeking out a second end range of motion, all three of those methods are going to work. A primary reason why PNF tends to do better in research studies is because of the fact that the neuromuscular relaxation is already built into the protocol. And then I'll talk about progression within the context of some of my bullet points regarding the additional information. So a critical point to understand, which just isn't really being put out there adequately by the fields of exercise science and sports medicine, is that the intent of a prescription or flexibility training should be to create flexibility balance around each major joint. And what that implies is that a joint range of motion assessment has occurred, which is a perfect world situation that unfortunately just doesn't really exist, but I'm heavily biased towards it because the truth is fitness professionals are allowed to stretch their clients. And because of that, by default, they should know their joint ranges of motion so they understand whether the areas they're stretching are tight, normal, or hypermobile. And even better, they would start off before even training their clients by performing a joint range of motion assessment from great toe to neck and everything in between. But this is all a perfect world situation. And my main point is that in a perfect world, you want to find out where you're tight, where you're normal, and where you're hypermobile. Because in the areas where you're normal, you either don't need to stretch them or you only need to stretch to the first end range of motion to maintain the normalcy, and there's no need to seek out a second end range of motion, or in other words, to move further into the stretch. Areas which are hypermobile don't need to be stretched, and focus needs to be placed on tight areas because tight areas are restricted areas, and movement restrictions increase the risk of injury. And it obviously just also means that the joint isn't able to easily move through its range compared to what would be normal. And since the body seeks balance, the most logical way to approach a flexibility training program is to focus on the tighter areas and move those areas to being at or near normal joint range of motion. And then I'm also including a fairly recent research article which shows how strength and conditioning coaches or fitness professionals can go about assessing the joint range of motion on their clients. This is something I've been doing for nearly the past 15 years of my career. And the way I go about it is actually really similar to how they suggest in this article. So I think it's a great resource for exercise specialists. You don't want to increase range of motion in areas that are already loose because of the increased risk of instability. And then lastly, while progression can occur by increasing frequency, the duration that you hold a stretch, potentially the intensity of the stretch, especially if you're at the low end of the intensity scale and need to increase it a little bit just to get more benefit. The primary way to progress to improve joint range of motion in areas that are tight, which is something that a lot of people aren't aware of, and then unfortunately they aren't doing, is to make sure that whether it's through PNF style stretching, where you're performing a contract relax, or whether you're just mentally relaxing into the stretch, you have to make sure that you stretch to your first end range of motion, and then somewhere in that 15, 20, or 25-second range, move further into the stretch to at the very least find a second end range. Because if you never move further into the stretch, you're never signaling your body to increase its range of motion. I've had a lot of conversations with clients over the course of my career who tell me that they stretch all the time and that it doesn't work for them, which I know is the case for a lot of other people as well. But unfortunately, what's happening, that while the frequency, duration, and intensity may be there, they only ever stretch to the first end range and they never try to find another one. So I know I'm repeating myself. So this is a really simple but critical concept to understand. And it leads to the conclusion that a flexibility training program will work as long as the frequency, the intensity, and the duration are adequate, and that the individual is making sure that they're progressing into the stretch as well. So if you're a coach, make sure you learn your joint ranges of motion, perform an initial assessment on your clients or your athletes. It's going to benefit everyone because it's going to make your eyes much more sensitive to movement, and you'll be able to see dysfunction that much easier. It will enable you to put your client or your athlete on a program to create flexibility balance around each joint. And if you're a layperson watching this video, you can either read that article, which I mentioned within this video, as a way to determine where you're tight, normal, or hypermobile. Or you can watch another one of my instructional videos on how to perform a joint range of motion assessment on yourself. But the bottom line is it's a lot more objective, it makes a lot more sense, and it really doesn't take that long once you know your joint ranges of motion to assess your flexibility at each major joint, as opposed to using a commercial assessment protocol, most of which do nothing better than give you just a general idea of where you might be tight, but they don't really pinpoint it, and many times it just leaves you guessing. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.